Well, greetings, folks, and welcome to this episode of the podcast. Great to have you along with us here this week. There is a lot going on in Alberta right now, changes coming to electoral boundaries, referendum coming up this fall, possibly including a vote on Alberta's future in Canada, and still lurking behind the scenes, some brewing scandals and controversies around government spending and contracts. So joining us for much more on all of this, we're very pleased to welcome to the program Peter Guthrie. He is, of course, the MLA for Airdrie Cochrane and leader of the Alberta Progressive Tory Party. Much more at albertatory.ca. Peter, great to have you back with us here.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Glad to be here.
Let's talk about the work going on to launch this party, build up this party. It's been quite a road for you, obviously, but you did just recently have an official launch. What's the status, first of all, of the Alberta Tory Party? Where are things at?
Yeah, I mean, initially we had just about every curveball thrown at us as you possibly could. Threats of litigation, which actually is still overhanging. Finally we did receive a name change at Christmas time. We kind of really didn't get ourselves going until the new year, but we've had a tremendous amount of progress recently. We're putting all of the pieces in place. And I'm very, very pleased with where we are right now, and you're going to be seeing a lot more out of us going forward.
We assume there's a year and a half before the next election, which gives you some time, but I don't know if there's a guarantee that that's how long it's going to be. And we constantly hear rumors or rumblings that, maybe the government's tempted in an early election call. What's your read on the situation and, your thoughts on the timeline and what you can do to get ready for the next election?
Yeah, I don't think that they'll do anything this year. With the referendum, that's questions that are going to be coming up in the fall, and especially on separation. I don't think that that's something that they would like to have coincide with a general election. Right. So I would think that probably the most likely time frame would be in the spring. But yeah, I mean, I'm hearing the same thing. This is a government that's quite unpredictable. So I'm really not sure, but we're doing our best to just make sure that we're ready to go, and we're gonna act as though there is going to be an early election. And right now, it's the legislation states that it should be in October 18th, in fact, I think, of 2027. But once again, highly unpredictable situation, as we're seeing. I mean, even right now with the latest report that came out with the electoral boundaries.
Well, let's get into that. I mean, it's kind of unprecedented what we're seeing here, where the government has rejected the majority recommendation for a new map in this report, and they're going to kind of do it their way. Now, the premier insists they're not going to be gerrymandering. They're not going to accept this controversial minority recommendation that certainly seemed like gerrymandering. But what do we make of these assurances, first of all?
Yeah, I think the argument that the government makes that 91 seats may be more palatable than 89. I mean, if there's been, let's say, since the last election, about growth in this province of about 800,000 people, I'm not going to debate that with them. That may be something that I'll give them. But as far as whether or not this is going to be an independent process, that's where I have great concern, because this current commission, they already went out. They've studied the boundaries. They put forward their report based on 89 seats. They've done two public interactions to take in submissions and put forward an independent report. I mean, to me, I think that they would have been the best equipped to expand this out to 91. And I think with the feedback that they've received over the course of the last year of that commission being together, they could have easily done that and could have done it in short order, and it could have been done in an independent fashion. So for the government to take over this process, I mean, it certainly does bring into question, what their interpretation of fair and just boundaries is going to look like. And I think you're probably well aware of the minority report that was in that latest Boundary Commission submission, and that came direct from government. And it has already been determined that it would not pass under a judicial review, but that came direct from government. So it gives you a pretty good idea on where they want to go with the boundaries.
Well, it gives us something, I guess, to watch for here. That does this process ultimately produce something that looks like what was this minority recommendation in this report? Do you think that there's enough scrutiny here around all of this that it might scare the government away from that temptation, or how on guard do we still need to be here? Do you think?
I think we should be quite on guard. There has been quite a bit of a stir over this. To me, I'm hoping that they just back away and keep the commission together. In fact, I think the commission, in probably pretty short order, in a matter of maybe a month to 6 weeks, based on all of the research that they've done to date, they may be able to put something together that we could get before the House, before the summer, rather than going through this process of a brand new submission, something that wouldn't be tabled until possibly late October, early November, and then pass through in the legislature later this year. Elections Alberta has stated that they're going to require 18 months to implement. So if that's the case, if this wasn't implemented until, say, late this year, December of this year, and there was a spring election, we could be talking a handful of months, 3-4 months before it's being implemented. And if it is offside, it would give very little opportunity from a judicial perspective to overturn it.
Yeah. It's interesting to me because I think there is a fundamental conflict of interest or an inherent sort of bias on the government's part to preserve rural ridings where they obviously have an advantage. A lot of the growth we've seen in Alberta has been in Edmonton and Calgary and in the cities, but it's not that cut and dry either. I mean, your riding's an interesting example of what we're seeing in Alberta. Airdrie and Cochrane have been two of the fastest growing communities in the province, but that riding still does include some rural areas. So there are situations where there is that overlap. There are different kinds of unique challenges, I guess, when it comes to representing a lot of these ridings. What does your experience tell you about how Alberta's changing and what needs to be factored into this kind of map?
Yeah, no doubt. When we've had 800,000 people come to this province for the opportunities that we have here, I mean, that's fantastic. We're leading the country in economic growth. I mean, I love that. Love to see it. That said, around Calgary, there's been tremendous growth with Cochrane and Airdrie, my constituency here, being one of the fastest growing in not only in Alberta but in Canada. Of course, that presents a lot of concern, a lot of growth issues that come with that. But if you look at the submission that was put forth by the UCP, they had taken Cochrane and they had actually tried to incorporate areas of Calgary that may not be beneficial to them in the inner city votes. Right. So they were trying to move it out into a rural type riding to be able to salvage the vote from gerrymandering, I guess basically is what they call it in Calgary. And that sort of thing was going on all around the city of Calgary. So that's where I don't have the confidence that the UCP is going to do the right thing where this is concerned.
Does that suggest that they're worried about the next election? I mean, they still seem to be doing, at least if we believe opinion polls, relatively well. I think, for now, the main opposition, the NDP, are dealing with some of their own challenges. What does it tell us about their insecurity, perhaps, going into the next election?
I agree. When you look at this, it doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, they boast regularly about the strength that they have, and yet you see them taking away power from, say, the educators, from municipalities, and trying to bring that inside of their own domain. And so, I mean, if you had confidence in your position, you wouldn't go out and try to manipulate this process in your favor. You would let the people speak, and you would let an independent commission. You would let them have their jurisdiction and let them make their determination. As I can say, every other previous authority has in this province. And in fact, I think all across Canada, this would be the first time that a government has actually taken over the process, which does, warrant some confusion. But I certainly think that they do and they should maintain independence where this is concerned. And I hope that the public, sees and understands what's going on here. I find it hard to believe that there won't be manipulation by the government where these boundaries are concerned.
One of the issues they're nervous about, and whether it carries over the next election remains to be seen. But, the scandal about health contracts and decisions that were made about how those contracts were awarded and whether there was political pressure for things to go a certain way. We've learned a lot about the money that was squandered on the children's Tylenol procurement. We're sort of waiting for that other shoe to drop, I guess. The Auditor General's report into all of this. We're also hearing about potential RCMP investigations around all of this. You've been pretty focused on this issue, trying to get answers from the government. What are you anticipating we may learn in the weeks and months ahead here?
Yeah, it is fascinating. The Auditor General was unable to finish his report. This Auditor General is going to be outgoing, I believe, on April 28th. Right. That does raise some questions. The RCMP have issued warrants to friends of government over the past 6 weeks, let's say. And I'm sure that that's causing consternation inside of the government. And, those do take time. It could take a matter of months before we see any of those come to fruition, if they do at all. But I wouldn't be surprised if the decision to not release information, from the Auditor General had something to do with that, not wanting to, say, damage the insights and the reporting and the investigation that's ongoing.
And this is kind of related, and it might seem like it's a procedural thing in the legislature, but I think it's important when it comes to getting answers and holding government to account. You've been raising some questions in the legislature around how public dollars are being spent, how the control of information is being consolidated. But there's been a change made recently that allows the government essentially to punt on giving those answers, up to now 120 days that they have to respond to questions once those are tabled. Explain what's changed and why this is worrying when it comes to oversight and accountability.
Yeah, it's fascinating. You get one question a week. Myself, I get one question a week. It doesn't, and the government doesn't provide you with adequate responses. Let's say that. You can ask the question, but they don't necessarily have to answer. So there are other mechanisms. There's written questions and motions for return. Those you submit in a formal way through the Speaker's office, and they go on the order paper. And it used to be that there was a 20-day response time, and now that's days that are sitting in the House. The UCP has expanded that out to 120 days, something like that. Now, what they wanted to do there is push it out to a period of time in which they could prorogue the House and then close down, and that they never have to answer the questions that have been put forth. And so there's a variety of questions that I've submitted, I think, that would deserve answers. But they've taken away a lot of mechanisms. They've now limited it to 3 per submission, 3 questions. I think I had submitted in the order of 18, a little under 20. And, the questions, I think, are some that are very important. I mean, about government spending and where's our are resources being used? And I think they're legitimate questions. Obviously, with me being somebody who was in cabinet, I have quite a bit of knowledge about where that money was going. Yeah. And there's a good reason why I'm asking those questions. And, I do have, there's still that cabinet confidentiality that I have to hold on to. So I can't fully disclose that, but I'm just looking for ways to be able to let the public know as to what's going on, behind the shield within government. And these are some areas that I know needed exposing. But the UCP, they found a way around it by getting rid of completely motions for return. So that's gone. And my submission of written questions, well, those are just going to time out. And with the, probably next session, they will no longer be on the order paper, and I could resubmit them, but they would never see the light of day.
Yeah. Let me just ask you about the upcoming referendum. I mean, the questions we know are going to be on the ballot and the one we kind of assume will be. The government announced this week a new website that they're launching. I mean, it seems pretty clear that we're going to see public dollars spent toward promoting one side in this referendum, which is kind of an unusual spectacle. Just your thoughts, first of all, in terms of what was announced this week and these questions that we know are on the ballot October 19th.
Yeah, the government basically was saying that, we already feel that these are important and we want to move ahead with it. We're just out there to verify it. I did find it a bit odd that they are going to go out on a promotional tour here ahead of it to make sure that they get the result that they want. Quite frankly, when I think about ballot questions, the ballot questions that come to my mind would be in response to healthcare, perhaps education, could be cronyism and corruption. There's a lot of different things that can come to mind as far as the ballot questions, and I think separation will be huge. Yeah. So the questions that they put forth, I think, are a bit of a distraction tactic by the UCP, because they don't seem to fit in to where I think Albertans are the most curious. Mm-hmm. Affordability being another one. It doesn't even, their questions don't match with what sort of the top 5 issues of the province are. So once again, they do a good job at inundating the marketplace with a bunch of information that is completely irrelevant.
Questions around separation. I mean, this week the premier, I guess, kind of went out on a limb saying she wouldn't put a referendum on the ballot because she believes Alberta should remain in Canada. That got an interesting response from the separatist side, and they've kind of warned her not to do this, not to go down this path, asserting that the UCP now basically is a separatist party. The UCP does also seem to be dragging their feet on this Thomas Lukaszuk, the Forever Canadian petition, which is interesting. Where do things stand here, do you think?
It is fascinating, but, it depends on what room you're in as far as what the position that the government is going to take. That varies. I would say from the beginning, Danielle Smith and the team, so to speak, her team, they gained a lot of traction with those that were of the separatist mind, those that wanted an independent Alberta. And along the way, she's done whatever she can from the beginning, where she won the nomination, all the way through to today. We've seen it at the last AGM of the party, all the way through to till now. And I think that they're quite upset that the premier may be trying to hurt their chances. But as far as public support for independence, it was probably at its height when we had the newly elected Liberal federal government. Mm-hmm. And since then, it has done nothing but kind of go downhill. And I think the premier and her team have seen the writing on the wall to know that that's not going to be something that they should support. So that you're seeing what you're seeing now is them pulling away from that. And I think it's going to be very hard for them to separate themselves when they have been full bore against the federal government and about independence for the last 3.5 years. I don't know how you suddenly start to say that you're a federalist.
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, it seems like the government's gone out of its way several times to try to help the separatist petition along. It now seems once again stuck in the mud, it's kind of legal purgatory. And maybe for now the premier's content to leave it there. But, at the same time, this weird approach to the Thomas Lukaszuk Forever Canadian petition and dragging their feet at the committee level, now suggesting maybe somehow both questions could end up on the ballot in October, which is bizarre. Yeah. I mean, does it feel that one way or another we're getting this referendum in October? And what do you think it looks like?
It really, I mean, it makes no sense for them to be, working on another independence type question for that ballot. I mean, if you want to stop confusion, you can only have one question on there. And Thomas Lukaszuk, he had, let's call it 500,000 signatures. The biggest petition ever done in Alberta's history. I think the question that he put forth was clear. And if there's anybody who has a right to be on that ballot, it would be the Forever Canadian campaign. Mm-hmm. So to me, I mean, it should be cut and dry. But the UCP seems to be doing whatever they can to get in his way. And I really appreciate what he and his team have been doing, and they've been doing their best to stay out of the political realm with it and stay independent and hands off. So I too have been and trying to just support them wherever I can.
Well, yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, in terms of political involvement in all of this, I mean, the Alberta Progressive Tory Party is a very proud federalist party. And I know you're working on building up this party, holding the government to account. As we get into this debate in this campaign, do you see a role for yourself? Do you think it's important for federalists to speak out and be visible in all of this?
Definitely. And I will be. There's no doubt about it. I've been quite supportive. It's part of our platform, of which you will start to see more and more about our platform coming out over the course of the weeks to come. I think where there's a strong appetite for it. We had our first one come out last week, and we're going to continue with that. But being and remaining a strong part of Canada, that is primary to our party. I certainly, shouldn't be taking it for granted that we are going to win. We want to make sure, like when that vote I'm talking about next October, people shouldn't be complacent. We do want to make sure that you get as many people out as possible to that vote. Don't just think that it's a shoo-in. Things can happen, and if, let's say, the number is 25% that feel strongly that separation is the way that Alberta should go. If the other 75% don't get out of their seats and go, it could be a lot closer than anybody thinks. And so that's why I'm so encouraged by what I saw out of the campaign for the Forever Canadian campaign. And I really like and appreciate what they're doing to draw attention to this and make sure that people understand the significance of this upcoming vote. And if there is going to be a question on the ballot, I mean, I'm certain that Thomas Lukaszuk probably doesn't want to have that on there. But if there is going to be one, it should be theirs.
Yeah, they got there first. We'll see what happens on that front and all of these other issues. Some interesting weeks and months ahead. Much more is mentioned, albertatory.ca. Peter, thank you so much for making some time for us here. Really appreciate this.
Thanks. Yeah, good chatting with you, Rob.
All right. Well, our thanks once again to Peter Guthrie, the MLA for Airdrie-Cochrane and leader of the newly launched Alberta Progressive Tory Party. Remember, that was going to be originally a revival of the Alberta Progressive Conservative Party until government legislation scuttled that plan. And of course, Peter Guthrie was once a part of this government as UCP MLA and cabinet minister. So it'd be interesting to see what he's able to do with this new party, where it fits into what's essentially become, for now, a two-party system here in Alberta. Just a little bit more from what the Premier had to say this past week on the whole referendum issue, where things are going with regard to the question of a separatist vote this fall. Remember, the government's got its 9 questions. There was already the successful Forever Canadian petition. The separatists, in the meanwhile, are still sort of stuck in a legal limbo here with regard to their petition. Now, this goes back to December when Elections Alberta referred that question to the court. Court came back and said this is constitutionally problematic. And so at the time, things were kind of stuck in the mud. The Alberta government intervened, said it didn't really matter if a question was constitutional. The petition continued. But First Nations took up the cause in court. They're trying to scuttle this whole effort. They got an injunction recently. It doesn't stop the petition from collecting signatures, but it stops it from being verified by Elections Alberta. So it's possible that a judge could come back and just scuttle the whole thing, as First Nations are hoping for. Now, the separatists have looked to the Premier to step in, because if their petition gets quashed, the Premier could theoretically just put that question on the ballot anyway. But when she was asked about it this week, she was pretty clear as to why she would not do so, and it was not an answer that went over well with the separatist movement. Here's what she said.
Well, because my position is that we should remain in Canada. That's the position of our government. We believe that we should assert sovereignty within a united Canada. So that is our policy. And so others are putting forward a proposal that would have a different position. And so it would not be a government-sponsored question. It would be one that would be a citizen-initiated response. And so we're waiting to see if the court will affirm that and allow the signature collection to go to be validated. I don't want to prejudge what the court's going to do. I believe they're going to be making their decision in May.
Okay, so that was interesting. As mentioned, the response there from the Premier that she's not putting a referendum on separation on the ballot because she doesn't believe in separation. She believes in remaining in Canada. I think it's a positive indication that she's not going to be on the fence here, but it'll be interesting to see what kind of backlash there is within her own party. Now, some polls have suggested that at least a majority of self-identified UCP supporters support or are sympathetic to separatism. And clearly, the separatist movement has sought to exert its influence within the UCP. And this week after the Premier's comments, one of these separatist leaders basically denounced Smith for saying that she shouldn't be involved in the Remain in Canada side of things or in that campaign, and suggested that if she did, it might not bode well for her leadership. Kind of an implied threat that it could jeopardize her leadership of the party if she takes the Remain in Canada side, the federalist side. So we'll see where that all goes. But there was the answer from the Premier as to why she's not going to put the question on the ballot. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be a referendum. In fact, there is already one successful petition, that from the Forever Canadian group. And we've spoken with Thomas Lukaszuk before. We talked about it with Peter Guthrie. Now, here's the thing. I mean, Thomas Lukaszuk has said the option that he went with does not obligate the Alberta government to put it to a referendum. There is the option of simply voting in the legislature and being done with it, and that's clearly what they prefer. So the Premier's talked about, Thomas Lukaszuk changing his mind on this. That's not the case. And he has said before that, look, they would prefer this be voted in the legislature, but if there's going to be a referendum, they would prefer it be their question, because it sort of flips the yes and no around, and it's framed differently. So that may end up being the question. This was a successful, in fact, a very successful petition campaign. It's all been verified, but it's sort of stuck in like legislative limbo, bureaucratic limbo. The government's been dragging its feet. A committee has finally met, discussed this, but now that's been put off, and it's not going to be dealt with until later this year. So in the meantime, you've got the separatist petition that may or may not get verified or validated by Elections Alberta. Now, this other petition that was verified by Elections Alberta that is sort of stuck in limbo. But the fact that you've got two petitions, both dealing with the question of Alberta's place in Confederation, does raise some questions here, like which prevails? Which would the Premier prefer to see be put to voters? And is it even possible, as Post-Media columnist Don Braid asked the Premier this week, that you could somehow end up with both of these questions on the ballot?
Yes, I mean, that's what the committee is looking at right now. So the box he checked, if you go and look at the document that I put up, it says a legislative or policy proposal required a signature of 10% of electors on post-election day list. And the alternative was a constitutional referendum proposal that talked about a 20% threshold. That was the distinction before we made them both the same. But if you look at how he structured this, he said the applicant is motivated by the fact that Alberta's separation from Canada is being actively discussed. Since a referendum appears to be imminent anyway, it should be objective and not directed by special interest groups. Separation will threaten the Canadian as well as the Alberta economy, the personal wealth of Albertans, the Canadian citizenship rights of Alberta residents, the treaty rights of our First Nations, and have many other serious and negative consequences. We believe the majority of Alberta residents are loyal Canadians and opposed to any form of separation. Therefore, we, as represented by the signatory and applicant below, propose a referendum on the following question. Do you agree that Alberta should remain in Canada? So we had 450,000 people sign onto this expecting a referendum. So I know that the proponent has changed his mind afterwards, saying he just wants it to go to the legislature, but that's what we're having to talk to Elections Alberta about, to justice officials about, because it does seem to me that this is kind of a legal process initiated in a legal way with precise language that people signed on a certain expectation. And so we're just trying to get some direction from the committee on that. They've had their first meeting and I'm looking forward to seeing what they come back with.
So you are open to having that Forever Canadian petition on the ballot if it meets all these requirements? I'm assuming that's correct.
That's correct. Yeah.
And then what do you do though about the separatism referendum? Because one of the things in the legislation is that you can't have two questions on basically the same subject. Would you also expect the separatist question to be on the October 19th ballot?
Well, I guess we have to see what the court determines in May, because they're the ones who have asked for this one has validated signatures, so that's one thing I would say. But we'd have to wait and see what the court has to say about that particular question, and they've asked for the validation to be paused until the judge has a chance to issue her report. So that's what we're waiting for, and we're waiting to see what her guidance is.
Okay, so we'll see where this all goes from here. I think one way or another, there's probably still going to be a question regarding separation on the ballot this fall. We just don't know which question or what that looks like, but we'll see if we get some clarity in the weeks ahead. One other issue I wanted to touch on here, and this concerns a government bill that was tabled this week, and I guess it also speaks to the whole question of referendums. Back in 2021, one of the referendum questions Albertans were asked was with regard to daylight saving time. We've got a piece up on all of this at robbreakenridge.ca. The Alberta government has decided we need to end the practice of changing the clocks twice a year, and we're going to settle on permanent daylight time. Now, this was a question that Albertans said no to in 2021. Despite that, the Alberta government is going to proceed. Albertans will not be asked again, at least not for now, whether we want to make this change. Although when she was asked about that this week, the Premier suggested that it might still be something Albertans are asked about in the future. Once we've made this change, we've had to live with this change for a while, maybe we'll get to decide whether we want to keep it.
First of all, we would have to give enough notice. I think that's what we saw when BC ended up announcing that they were not going to be changing the clocks again, because there are a number of different professions that rely on doing schedules in advance, airlines, hockey games. There's a number of things. So making sure that we're not giving people only a couple of weeks notice was one of the considerations. One of the other considerations is just that we are now an island, that we're seeing that American states are passing policies saying that they want to end the time change. British Columbia got a little impatient. They said they can't wait for America to go. They're going first. Saskatchewan's already there. Yukon's already there. And Northwest Territories got in touch with us and said, hey, if you go, we'll go too. So I think that the decision got foisted upon us just because we knew that in the fall, people would be asking us, hey, why didn't you do this? Because everybody else has gone the same way. Just remember, when you change the time, it's like giving jet lag to your entire population twice a year. And we know that there's impacts on that. So I thought that there was a pretty elegant solution that was suggested by somebody on the radio show. They said, why not live it? People don't really know what it's going to be until they live it. This is our opportunity. Won't be a time change in the fall. Won't be a time change again in the spring. People will see what it means to have a little bit later sunrise and a little bit later sunset. And then I'm sure we will hear. If people are outraged and furious about it, I have no doubt we will hear about it. But I suspect what will happen is that people will say, oh yeah, okay, we're on daylight 8 months out of the year. And if my choice is having a little bit later sunrise in the fall or in the winter versus a 4 a.m. sunrise in summer, which is what standard would be, I think on balance, they would probably agree with the majority that daylight savings is the way to go.
I appreciate that. And you bring up the caller that had recommended the trial period.
Yeah.
And I remember, if I remember correctly, he had mentioned the trial period and then giving Albertans the chance to have their say afterwards. And so my question would be is when you introduce the permanent daylight time for, as you said, the trial period, will there in that be the confirmation that Albertans will then have the chance to vote on it in the next, like in a year after they've lived it for a year?
Well, let's see how people are after they've lived it through this winter. Because again, as I say, no one's shy of telling me what their opinion is, and so I'm sure we'll get a gauge on whether or not people think that we've made a mistake. And if that's the case, then we have time, if we need to add an additional referendum question to the ballot in October 2027. But I think we need to live it first and then see what the reaction is.
Okay, so there was the Premier's explanation as to why we're not getting an opportunity to have another say this time around with regard to daylight saving time. The Alberta government is proceeding and making this change. Well, at least the legislation's been tabled. It has to pass the legislature first. And yes, what's different now versus 5 years ago is the fact that BC is ending the clock change. Saskatchewan already does not change the clocks. In fact, the Northwest Territories is even looking at doing so. So when all of our neighbors are going that direction, maybe it puts some pressure on Alberta to do the same. The other lingering question, though, it's not just you want to stop changing the clocks twice a year. It's, what do you want to land on? Right? The question in 2021 was specifically, do you want to go to permanent daylight time? And that's what Albertans said no to. That's what we're going with this time around. Now, there's some other experts who have said, look, if we're going to stop changing the clocks, standard time is the way to go. And so it sort of becomes a three-way debate. Right? Do you want to stop the clocks versus going with daylight time, going with standard time? And in that debate, you get the question of, well, what about sunrise? What about sunset? If we're going to go with daylight time, yeah, we'll have a little bit later sunset in the winter, but then the sun rises later. And you got the issue of, darkness when kids are going to school and everyone's going to work and all of these other issues. Whereas with standard time, though, you get really early, like 4 or 5 a.m. sunrise in those summer months. So there's trade-offs, and that was the whole point of changing the clocks, was to try to split the difference. So I think this debate will continue. You heard the Premier's explanation for why there won't be a referendum this time around, but perhaps we've not heard the last of this debate or the last of a referendum on this debate. So as mentioned, much more at robbreakenridge.ca. That's where we'll leave it for this episode of the podcast. Again, you can find us on YouTube, on podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and the rest. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, my name is Rob Breakenridge. We will talk to you next week. Take care. Hey, folks, thanks for watching and listening. You can find us at robbreakenridge.ca. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button below and stay connected with The Rob Breakenridge Show.